The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Professor Ambrose Whitmore held the envelope in hands that had started trembling 6 months ago. Not constantly, just when he was tired or when the light hit a certain way and reminded him of the hospice room where Margaret had spent her final weeks. The return address was his daughter's, San Francisco. She wrote every month dutiful letters about her work, her husband, the grandchildren Ambrose saw twice a year if he
As you
was
can see
lucky.
from the text,
But
the
this
implications are
envelope felt
profound.
different,
Indeed,
heavier.
and it aligns
He
with the
set it on
historical
his desk
records.
unopened and looked around the study that had been his refuge for 43 years. Books climbed toward oak-beamed ceilings, medieval manuscripts in reproduction, Tudor portraits, Greek pottery catalogs, Roman military histories, the accumulated debris of a career spent teaching students about the parts of history that textbooks skipped, the unglamorous parts, the human parts, the details that made the past feel real instead of remote. On the corner of his desk, a photograph. Margaret at Corinth, 1987, squinting against Mediterranean sun, holding up a pottery fragment like she'd discovered treasure, which in a way she had. That piece of clay had crossed 2,000 years to reach her hand, connected her to people who'd walked the same ground, watched the same competitions, worshipped the same gods. She'd kept it on her nightstand for 37 years, until the hospice staff had boxed up her possessions and Ambrose had brought everything home to a house that echoed with absence. He'd put the fragment on his desk. Couldn't bear to have it in the bedroom. Couldn't bear to put it away. The letter sat beside it waiting. Ambrose Whitmore was 68 years old, retired from Columbia 3 years ago, widowed for 9 months, and increasingly convinced that the history he'd spent his life studying was trying to tell him something he'd been too dense to hear. He opened the letter. "Dad, we need to talk about your living situation. Tom and I have been discussing it, and we think it's time you considered moving closer to us, or at least into a community where you'd have support. The house is too big for one person. You're isolated out there. I know you love the study, love your books, but maybe it's time to think about what comes next. We could find you a nice place near us. The grandkids would love to see you more often. Please think about it. Call me." Love, Sarah. Ambrose set the letter down carefully as if it might detonate. What comes next? As if he hadn't been thinking about exactly that every day since Margaret died. Every morning waking to an empty house. Every evening making dinner for one. Every night sitting in this study surrounded by books about people who'd been dead for centuries, wondering what the point was of knowing so much about the past when you couldn't do anything about the present. He stood. His knee protested. 68 wasn't old, not really, but his body was starting to collect small betrayals. The trembling hands, the stiff knee, the way his eyes needed more light than they used to. He walked to the window. November afternoon, early dusk already gathering. His garden showed the exhaustion of autumn. Dead leaves, bare branches, everything preparing for winter dormancy. Like him, he supposed. He'd been preparing for dormancy since Margaret died, going through motions, eating because he was supposed to, sleeping because the alternative was staring at ceilings, existing because stopping seemed like more work than continuing. But Sarah's letter had clarified something. He wasn't ready for dormancy, not yet. If he was going to move into some antiseptic retirement community, if he was going to pack up this study and these books and this life, if he was going to admit that his useful years were finished, then he wanted to do one more thing first. He wanted to teach one more class. Not in a university, not to students who'd forget him by graduation, but something that mattered. Something that would justify all these years of accumulation. Something that would answer the question Margaret had asked him 3 weeks before she died. What was it all for Ambrose? All this knowledge, what are you going to do with it? He told her he didn't know. She'd smiled. The morphine made her smile soft, distant. Then figure it out, before you run out of time. Ambrose turned from the window, looked at his desk, at the books, at the pottery fragment that had survived empires and wars and centuries to end up in Margaret's hand, then his. He sat down, pulled out a legal pad, started writing. An hour later, he had an outline. 12 lectures, the invisible history, the parts no one taught because they seemed trivial. Medieval people who never saw their faces. Tudor women who died for beauty. Greek athletes who competed for worthless prizes. The ordinary absurdities that revealed more about human nature than any battle. He'd record them, put them online somewhere. Maybe no one would watch. Probably no one would watch. But he'd have done something, left something, answered Margaret's question. What was it all for, this? One more attempt to make the past matter to the present. He looked at the pottery fragment. All right, he said to it, to Margaret's memory, to the empty study. One more class. Then we'll talk about what comes next. The fragment sat silent on his desk, holding 2,000 years of history in its broken curve. Ambrose turned on his desk lamp, pulled out his notes from 40 years of teaching, started planning. Outside darkness completed its claim on the day. Inside, something that might have been purpose stirred in the accumulated dust of scholarship. The first recording happened on a Friday. Ambrose had bought a simple camera, propped it on a tripod, arranged the study lighting as best he could. Felt ridiculous doing it. He was a professor, not a performer. His medium was chalkboards and lecture halls, not cameras and the internet. But he pressed record anyway. "My name is Ambrose Whitmore," he said to the camera, to whoever might eventually watch this. "I taught history at Columbia University for 40 years, retired now. And I want to tell you about the parts of history that nobody talks about." He paused. This felt harder than he'd expected, more exposed. Not the famous battles, not the great speeches, the small stuff. The daily indignities, the adaptations people made just to survive another Tuesday. The things that were so normal back then, nobody thought to write them down. His hands weren't trembling. Small victory. "My wife Margaret died 9 months ago. Before she died, she asked me what all this knowledge was for. All these years of research and teaching. What was I going to do with it?" He looked down at his notes, then back at the camera. "I didn't have an answer then, but I think I do now. Knowledge dies when it's not shared. History fades when no one tells it. So I'm going to tell it. These 12 lectures, the invisible history, starting with something simple." He held up a reproduction of a medieval manuscript. In the year 1347, a woman named Marjorie lived outside York. She bore 3 children, tended chickens, survived the Black Death, died at 38. And here's what haunts me. She died without ever knowing what she looked like. He set the manuscript down. Not approximately, not sort of. She had no idea what her face looked like, and neither did almost anyone else in medieval Europe, because mirrors, actual reflective mirrors, were luxury items, for nobility only. Everyone else got by with water reflections, pond surfaces, well water, brief distorted glimpses that vanished when you reached toward them. Ambrose stood. The camera followed him as he walked to a small mirror on his wall. We take this for granted. The ability to see ourselves clearly, to check if our hair is right, if we look tired, if we're aging the way we expected. Medieval people had none of that. They learned what they looked like from other people's descriptions. Your mother says you have your father's nose. A neighbor remarks you look exhausted. That's your mirror. Brutal social feedback. He returned to his desk. Imagine building your entire self-image from secondhand descriptions. Imagine the confidence that might create. Or the insecurity. Imagine having no visual proof of your own existence except the faces that looked back at you and told you what they saw. He picked up the pottery fragment. "Margaret found this at Corinth, probably piece of an amphora. Could have held wine oil grain. Someone used this 2,000 years ago. Someone who probably never saw their own face clearly either." He set it down gently. "That someone is dead. The amphora is broken. But the fact remains. They lived, they worked, they survived without something we consider essential. The ability to see ourselves." Ambrose looked directly at the camera. "In our first lecture, we'll explore what it meant to live without mirrors. What medieval people lost. What they maybe gained. How identity worked when you couldn't verify it visually." He reached toward the camera, then paused. "One more thing. If you're watching this, if you make it through all 12 lectures, do me a favor. Tell someone else. Share it. Not because I need the attention, but because history dies in silence. It survives in telling." He turned off the camera, sat in the quiet study. His hands were steady, his breathing was even, and for the first time in 9 months he felt something that might have been purpose. Margaret would have laughed at him, setting up a camera in his study like some kind of internet personality. But she also would have approved. She'd spent her life believing knowledge was meant to be shared, not hoarded. He uploaded the video that night, created a simple channel, The Invisible History, posted the first lecture. By Monday, it had 17 views. Tuesday, 43. Wednesday, 106. By the following Monday, 15,000. Someone had shared it on a history forum, then a retirement community discussion board. Then it started spreading through networks of older men who remembered when learning meant sitting in libraries, taking notes by hand, actually thinking about things instead of skimming for content. The comments started coming in. "I'm 72, never thought about mirrors. Makes me wonder what else I take for granted. Served in Korea. We went weeks without seeing our faces. You described it perfectly. The weird freedom of it. My grandfather used to say, you only need mirrors if you're vain. Now I understand what he meant. Ambrose read every comment, felt something unfamiliar. Connection, maybe. The sense that what he knew mattered to people he'd never meet. He recorded the second lecture on a Thursday. Romance in the medieval world, Ambrose began, was heartfelt, emotional, and frequently outsourced to celibate monks who judged your grammar. He was more comfortable with the camera now, less stiff, starting to find a rhythm. Literacy was rare, expensive, reserved for clergy nobles and that one irritating town official who read documents aloud very slowly. So when medieval people wanted to express love, devotion, uncontrollable longing, they hired a professional, a scribe, a clerk, sometimes a monk. He pulled out a reproduction of medieval correspondence. Picture this. You enter a room that smells like ink and parchment. You clear your throat. Say, I need a letter, a love letter. The scribe nods, dips his quill, asks, how intense are we talking? A pause for effect. He was learning timing. Then comes confession. You dictate your feelings out loud, slowly, while another human being writes down every word with the emotional distance of someone taking grocery notes. Tell her my heart burns for her. The scribe pauses. Burns as in spiritually or burns as in alarming? Ambrose held up the correspondence. Medieval love letters followed strict formulas, opening praises, emotional declarations, vows of loyalty, dramatic flourishes borrowed from classical texts. If you weren't eloquent enough, the scribe helped. Would you like to compare her beauty to the dawn, the rose, or divine light? This wasn't non-optional. Romance had formatting requirements. He set the letter down. Here's what makes it almost unbearable. The scribe often knew both parties. Small towns didn't offer anonymity. Your love letter might be written by the man who baptized your beloved, taught her cousin to read, and absolutely knew she was already engaged. He looked at the camera. Professional discretion was encouraged. Professional silence was hopeful. And sometimes scribes reuse phrases. When you write dozens of love letters a year, patterns happen. Somewhere out there, two medieval lovers received suspiciously similar compliments and never compared notes. Ambrose picked up a pen. I wrote Margaret one letter in my life. 1978. I was in London doing research. She was in Boston finishing her dissertation. International calls were expensive. So I wrote 3 pages. Told her I missed her, that I'd been thinking about the future, asked if she'd marry me. He set the pen down, mailed it on a Tuesday, spent 2 weeks convinced I'd made a mistake, that I'd been too earnest, that she'd read it and realized I was ridiculous. A pause. She sent a telegram, 3 words, yes, come home. He looked at the camera directly. Medieval people did this constantly, dictated their hearts to strangers, sent those hearts into the world with no guarantee of safety, and somehow it worked. People married, hearts broken, mended. Romance wasn't private, wasn't discreet, but it was sincere. He reached toward the camera, even when dictated, maybe especially when dictated. Because if you're willing to stand in front of a celibate monk and say out loud that someone makes your heart burn, that's commitment or desperation. A slight smile. Medieval sources are unclear on which. He turned off the camera. The video went up Friday night. By Monday, it had 30,000 views. The comments shifted. I wrote my wife one letter, 53 years ago. She still has it. Now I know why it mattered. My father dictated letters to my mother during World War II. A chaplain wrote them. I found them after Dad died, never understood why they felt so formal. Now I do. This made me cry. I'm 68 and just realized I've never written a real letter. Just emails. Just texts. Nothing that cost me anything. Ambrose read that last comment 3 times. Nothing that cost me anything. He thought about the cost of Margaret's telegram. Not the money, the vulnerability, the willingness to say yes to a future that wasn't guaranteed. To commit to a story that might not have a happy ending. It hadn't in the end. She died at 65. Breast cancer. 10 months of treatment. 3 weeks in hospice. Then gone. But the telegram had been worth it. The letter had been worth it. The 37 years between them had been worth it. He recorded the 3rd lecture with something hardening in his chest. Not grief. Something sharper. Determination. I'm left-handed, Ambrose said to the camera, holding up his left hand. Born that way. In 2024, this means I have trouble with scissors. In 1347, it would have meant I was probably cursed. He'd decided to make this one personal. The Latin word for left is sinister. Right-handedness was associated with order, righteousness, divine favor. Left-handedness was linked to chaos, deception, doing things the wrong way. Literally. He picked up a pen with his left hand. Left-handed children were corrected, trained out of it. Teachers, parents, priests, all encouraging right-hand use. If you stubbornly favored your left hand, it wasn't seen as preference. It was seen as defiance or influence. By the devil, usually. Ambrose set the pen down. Medieval medical theory believed the body was divided into moral halves. Right side, strong, warm, noble. Left side, weaker, colder, prone to imbalance. If something went wrong physically, the left side got blamed. Obviously. He stood, walked to his bookshelf, pulled out a medieval medical text. Even daily rituals reinforced this. People crossed themselves with the right hand, swore oaths with the right hand raised, reached for communion with the right hand. Do any of this left-handed, you were committing small heresies every day. He returned to frame. I learned all this in graduate school. Found it fascinating academically. Then one semester I had a student who was left-handed. Brilliant kid. But he struggled with those terrible right-handed desks. Sat twisted at an uncomfortable angle, taking notes in obvious pain. Ambrose sat. One day I asked him why he didn't just use his right hand for writing. Save himself the trouble. He looked at me like I'd suggested he cut off a limb. Said, "Professor, this is how I think. Switching hands wouldn't just be uncomfortable. It would be like trying to think in a foreign language." He looked down at his left hand. That's when I understood. For medieval left-handed people, it wasn't about convenience. It was about fighting your own neurology to satisfy someone else's superstition. Every time you reached for bread with the wrong hand, you were committing a small rebellion. He looked back at the camera. Despite the correction, the suspicion, the medical theory, the religious pressure, left-handed people persisted. Worked, fought, wrote, cooked, survived. Many learned to switch in public, revert in private. Medieval code switching. But for hands. A pause. If you were left-handed in the Middle Ages, you weren't evil. You weren't cursed. You were just living in a world deeply offended by your coordination. He flexed his left hand. I'm grateful I was born in 1956 instead of 1356. Small mercies. He turned off the camera. This one felt different, more vulnerable. He'd put himself in it, not just his knowledge, but his experience. The video went up Tuesday. By Thursday, it had 50,000 views. The comments surprised him. Shema, I'm left-handed, 71 years old. My teachers tied my left hand behind my back in first grade, forced me to use my right. I still can't write comfortably. This explains why they did it. Doesn't make it right. My son is left-handed. I never thought about what that meant historically. Makes me angry on behalf of every left-handed kid who was corrected. I'm ambidextrous, never fit anywhere. Reading this, I realized my grandmother was probably left-handed, but trained out of it. She could do everything with both hands, but her left was always slightly better. And then buried in the comments one that made Ambrose stop. Professor Whitmore, you said your wife died 9 months ago. Are these lectures how you're processing grief because they're helping me process mine? My husband died last year. Your videos make me feel less alone. Ambrose stared at that comment for a long time. Are these lectures how you're processing grief? He hadn't thought of it that way. But maybe. Maybe that's exactly what this was. Using history to understand the present. Using the dead to make sense of living. He wrote back. Yes, I think maybe they are. I'm glad they're helping you too. Margaret would have liked that. She believed knowledge was meant to be shared, especially when it helps us understand we're not alone in our struggles. He hit send, sat in the quiet study. Something was shifting. The lectures weren't just about history anymore. They were becoming something else. A conversation, a community, people finding connection through shared knowledge and shared grief. He recorded the 4th lecture with tears he didn't try to hide. Medieval people named their tools, Ambrose began, and this time his voice wasn't quite steady. Not as a quirk, not as whimsy, but as a practical response to scarcity and dependence. He stood, walked to the corner where his grandfather's shovel leaned. This belonged to my grandfather. He called it Samuel. I thought that was a joke. It's not. He carried the shovel back to frame. When you own something for most of your life, when it helps you survive winters, dig fields, bury people you love, it earns a name. Axes, plows, knives, cooking pots, all referred to as if they were colleagues rather than property. Ambrose ran his hand along the worn handle. Weapons were especially personal. Swords, daggers, shields had names. Sometimes serious, sometimes affectionate. A blade that protected you in battle wasn't metal. It was a companion. Breaking it wasn't inconvenient. It was tragic. People didn't say my sword snapped. They said I lost him. He set the shovel carefully against his desk. But it didn't stop there. Ovens were named, doors were named, bells were named. If an object was central to survival, it crossed the line from tool to personality. An oven that baked good bread was praised. One that failed was insulted. Loudly, publicly. He sat. This wasn't superstition. It was practicality mixed with exhaustion. When your entire life depends on a handful of objects functioning properly, you develop relationships with them. You speak to them, blame them, thank them. Ambrose looked at the shovel. My grandfather died in 1989, lung cancer. Near the end, when he wasn't making sense anymore, he asked me to take care of Samuel. I thought he meant his brother. He meant the shovel. His voice caught. Made me promise. I promised. He cleared his throat. I've kept it 35 years. Don't use it much, but I oil the handle every spring. Check for rust. Keep the blade sharp. A long pause. Margaret used to ask why. I told her I made a promise, but it's more than that. It's continuity. Holding something that held the hands that came before mine. Maintaining a relationship that transcends utility. He looked at the camera. When Margaret died, the hospice gave me her belongings in a box. Her reading glasses. The book she'd been reading. A necklace I gave her on our 10th anniversary. And I realized, these aren't just objects. They're relationships. They held her hands, touched her skin, existed in her life. He picked up a pair of reading glasses from his desk. Margaret's. I can't throw these away. Not because they're valuable, because they're named, because Margaret's glasses mean something that old reading glasses doesn't. He set them down. Medieval people understood this, named their tools because those tools were part of their survival, part of their story, part of the continuity that connected them to the people who'd come before and would come after. He looked at the shovel again. Samuel, ridiculous name for a shovel. But my grandfather was serious, and now so am I. He reached toward the camera. In a world with very few possessions, each one mattered. Medieval people didn't just own objects, they lived with them. And sometimes that living was honored with names. He turned off the camera, sat in silence. The video went up that night. By morning, it had 75,000 views and hundreds of comments. People shared stories about objects they'd kept, tools that belonged to parents, jewelry from grandparents, books from teachers. Each object named, each object holding relationships that survived death. And Ambrose understood. These lectures weren't just about medieval history. They were about continuity, about how humans create meaning through objects, through names, through the things that outlast us. He was teaching, but he was also learning how to live with absence, how to honor what's gone, how to keep going when the person who made going worthwhile is no longer there. The first part was nearly done. 4 lectures recorded, 4 pieces of invisible history shared. But something else was happening. The community growing around these videos wasn't just learning history, they were supporting each other, sharing grief, finding connection. Margaret had asked what all this knowledge was for. Ambrose was starting to understand the answer. It was for this, for creating connection across time and distance, for reminding people they weren't alone in their struggles, their grief, their determination to keep going. The invisible history wasn't just about medieval people. It was about everyone who'd ever felt invisible, ever wondered if their life mattered, ever needed to know that 2,000 years from now, someone might find a fragment of their existence and say they lived, they mattered, they're worth remembering. He looked at the pottery fragment on his desk. Margaret had held this, had connected to someone across 2 millennia through this broken piece of clay. Now Ambrose was doing the same thing, connecting to strangers through shared knowledge, through invisible history, through the truth that we're all temporary, but the things we do, the knowledge we share, the connections we make, those can outlast us. He picked up his grandfather's shovel. Samuel, he said quietly, we're not done yet. Outside, November darkness claimed the evening. Inside, Ambrose Whitmore prepared for the second part of his journey, the part where invisible history would teach him how to face the visible truth he'd been avoiding, that Margaret was gone, that he was alone, that what came next was his choice, and that maybe, just maybe, there was still work to do before dormancy claimed him. The email arrived 3 weeks into the lecture series. Ambrose had just finished uploading the 5th lecture about medieval mobility, the constant, low-energy relocation of peasants who moved not toward opportunity, but toward maybe this place is slightly less cursed when the notification appeared. Subject, your mother would be proud. He stared at it. His mother had died in 1998, 26 years ago. Who would be writing about her now? He opened it. Professor Whitmore. We've never met. My name is Dr. Elena Morrison. I studied under your wife Margaret at Boston University in the early 2000s. She supervised my dissertation on material culture in Tudor England. I wanted to tell you that I've been watching your lecture series. Margaret used to talk about you constantly, about how you saw connections others missed, how you cared about the invisible people of history. But she also used to say you were running from something, using scholarship as armor against the present. I didn't understand what she meant then. Watching these lectures, I think I do now. I don't mean to overstep, but Margaret was important to me, and I think she'd want me to tell you that the invisible history you're teaching includes your own. The grief you're carrying, the isolation you're choosing. History is happening to you, Professor Whitmore. Not just around you. I hope that's not too forward. With respect and admiration, Dr. Elena Morrison Ambrose read it 3 times. Margaret supervised dissertations. Of course she did. She'd been a full professor at BU until her retirement in 2015. Had mentored dozens of students, and apparently talked about him enough that this woman, this stranger, felt comfortable telling him he was using scholarship as armor. She wasn't wrong. He'd been using scholarship as armor since Margaret got sick, buried himself in research while she underwent treatment, prepared lectures while she went to appointments, organized his library while she grew thinner, weaker, less herself. And after she died, he'd gone deeper, into books, into the past, into anywhere that wasn't the present tense of a house without her. These lectures were supposed to be different, supposed to be about connection, purpose, legacy. But Dr. Morrison was right. He was still running. The question was, from what or toward what? He looked at the outline for part 2. Beauty standards, Tudor cosmetics. The price women paid for appearance. He'd planned it as pure history, educational, informative, safe. But Dr. Morrison's email had cracked something open. History's happening to you. He sat at his desk, looked at Margaret's photograph. She was laughing in that picture head thrown back completely unself-conscious. She'd never cared about appearance, never worn makeup, never bothered with fashion. You were beautiful, he said to the photograph. You never believed me, but you were. The photograph offered no response. He picked up his camera, set it on the tripod. But before pressing record, he did something different. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out Margaret's journal, the one she'd kept during treatment, the one he hadn't been able to read since she died. He opened it to a random page. June 15th, 2023. Ambrose is avoiding me, not physically, but emotionally. He's burying himself in research, preparing for a seminar that doesn't start until fall. I know what he's doing. It's what he always does when he's scared. He retreats into the past because the present is too painful. I want to shake him, want to tell him that I'm still here, that hiding in history won't change what's happening. But I also love him for it, for needing something safe while everything else falls apart. I just wish he'd let himself feel it. The fear, the anger, the grief that's coming. I'm dying, and my husband is reading about the War of the Roses. Ambrose closed the journal. His hands were shaking. She'd known. Of course she'd known. Margaret always saw through him. And she'd died anyway with him, still hiding, still running, still using scholarship as armor against reality. He looked at the camera. Dr. Morrison was right. The invisible history included his own. If he was going to teach part 2 about beauty, about what it cost, about the price of meeting impossible standards, he had to stop hiding. He pressed record. My wife never wore makeup, Ambrose said, and his voice was already unsteady. I need to tell you that first, before we talk about Tudor cosmetics and deadly beauty standards, before we examine what women paid to meet impossible ideals. I need you to know that Margaret, my wife of 43 years, never wore makeup a day in her life. He paused, composed himself. She said she learned from Tudor history. That's what she told me on our second date. I'd made some academic joke about ceruse, that's lead carbonate, mixed with vinegars, a white face paint Tudor women used, and she got very serious. Said, I don't paint my face, I read what it did to them and decided no fashion was worth poison. He looked directly at the camera. I thought she was being dramatic. She wasn't. He pulled out a folder of Tudor portraits. Let's talk about what beauty cost in Tudor England. Not in abstract terms, in teeth, in hair, in years of life. In the slow poisoning of thousands of women who knew what they were doing was dangerous and did it anyway because the alternative was social death. He held up a portrait of a young woman, face luminously pale. This is what fashion required: skin white as porcelain, achieved through ceruse, lead-based paint applied thickly to face and neck. It worked brilliantly, made skin glow, covered blemishes, created that otherworldly pallor that signaled you didn't work outdoors, therefore you were noble, therefore you were valuable. Ambrose set the portrait down. It also killed you slowly. The lead seeped through skin, accumulated in tissue, attacked the nervous system. Early symptoms: fatigue, headaches. Later symptoms: hair loss, tooth decay, tremors, sores beneath the makeup. Final symptom: death. He pulled out a medical text. This is from a physician in 1605. He writes anonymously because he's afraid of offending noble families. I have observed 7 women of gentle birth who applied these preparations daily. 5 are dead before 30. The remaining 2 suffer continual ailments. I cannot speak publicly, so I write this for future physicians. He closed the book. 5 dead, 2 suffering, but all for the crime of wanting to look acceptable. His voice hardened, and the cruelest part they knew. Medical journals warned about cosmetic diseases. Physicians privately counseled against ceruse. Women watched their friends sicken and die, and most of them used it anyway. He stood, walked partially out of frame, then back. Why, that's the question that's bothered me for 40 years of studying this. Why would intelligent women choose slow poison? He sat. Because the social pressure was immense. Because a woman who appeared at court with natural skin, showing sun exposure or freckles, was judged harshly. Because looking healthy wasn't enough. You had to look untouched by labor. Otherworldly. Valuable. Ambrose picked up another portrait. This is Anne Clifford, painted around 1620. Look at her face. Natural. No ceruse. She stopped using cosmetics at 25. Just stopped. Washed her face with rainwater and soap. Let her natural complexion show. He set it down. She wrote in her diary, "I would rather be judged for plainness than die beautiful." That's a direct quote. She understood the mathematics, chose survival over appearance. He looked at the camera. But most women didn't have that luxury. If you wanted to marry well, you needed to look the part. If you wanted to keep your husband's attention, especially in elite circles where mistresses were common, you maintained your appearance. The alternative was being replaced. His voice dropped. So they chose poison, chose slow death, chose to meet impossible standards because refusing them meant social death, which felt worse than physical death. He picked up Margaret's photograph. Margaret understood this. That's why she never wore makeup. Not because she was vain about being natural, but because she'd studied what cosmetics cost Tudor women and refused to participate in any system, even a modern, safer one, that judged women's value by appearance. He set the photo down carefully. She was beautiful. I told her that constantly. She never believed me. Said beauty was a social construct designed to control women. I said I didn't care about social constructs, I cared about her face. She said I was being deliberately obtuse. A slight smile. We had that argument for 43 years. She never conceded. Neither did I. The smile faded. When she got sick, when the cancer treatment started making her lose her hair, making her thin and exhausted, she looked at me one morning and said, "Now you can't possibly think I'm beautiful." His voice broke. I told her she'd never been more beautiful. She called me a liar. I said I wasn't lying, I was seeing her clearly. She said, "That's not how beauty works." I said, "Maybe it should be." He wiped his eyes. She died looking nothing like that photograph. Bald from chemo, thin from illness, exhausted from pain. And I looked at her in that hospice bed and saw the same person I'd fallen in love with 43 years earlier. He looked at the camera. Beauty killed Tudor women, literally. Lead poisoning, mercury damage, slow death for the sake of appearance. And the system that created those standards that told women their value was tied to looking acceptable, that system was designed by men, enforced by men, profited men. His voice hardened. Women paid the price, in health, in years, in the constant, exhausting work of meeting standards that were designed to be unattainable. He stood. Margaret taught me that, not through lectures, but through living, through refusing to participate, through choosing herself over systems. He walked to the window, different blocking. The camera caught him in profile. When she died, people at the funeral talked about how gracefully she aged, how she looked distinguished, how she carried herself with dignity. Like those were compliments. Like she'd achieved something by aging visibly. He turned back. She would have hated that. would have said that commenting on how women age is just another way of judging them by appearance. Another version of the same system that killed Tudor women. He returned to his chair. So yes, let's talk about deadly fashion, about cosmetics that poisoned, about beauty standards that killed. But let's also talk about why, about the systems that created those standards, about who profited, about who paid. He looked directly at the camera. And let's talk about the women who refused, like Anne Clifford, who chose plainness over poison, like Margaret Whitmore, who chose herself over systems. He reached toward the camera, then paused. This lecture is dedicated to my wife, who taught me that beauty isn't about appearance. It's about being seen clearly by someone who matters. And that the only opinion about your appearance that should matter is your own. He turned off the camera, sat in silence. His hands were shaking again. But not from age, from finally letting himself feel what he'd been avoiding for 9 months. The grief, the anger, the absolute unfairness of losing someone who'd taught him how to see. He uploaded the video that night. By morning, it had broken 100,000 views. The comments were different this time. I'm crying at my desk. My wife died 2 years ago. She also never wore makeup. I never understood why it mattered until now. I'm a woman in my 60s. I've worn makeup every day since I was 16. This made me wonder why, who I'm doing it for. I don't have an answer. Professor, I'm sorry for your loss, but thank you for letting us see your grief. It makes the history more real, makes all of it more real. And then from Dr. Elena Morrison, Margaret would be proud. You're finally letting yourself be visible. That's harder than any scholarship. Ambrose stared at that comment for a long time. Letting yourself be visible. He'd spent 9 months hiding, in books, in the past, in scholarship that kept him safely distant from the present. But these lectures were changing that, forcing him into visibility, making him confront not just Tudor history, but his own. He recorded the next lecture 2 days later. Queens' bodies weren't private, Ambrose began. When you married a king, your body became public property. Every feature examined, every change interpreted, every failure potentially fatal. He was calmer now. The grief from the previous lecture had settled into something else. Determination, maybe. Let's talk about Anne Boleyn, not the mythology, the reality. She was not conventionally beautiful by Tudor standards. Contemporary accounts make that clear. Dark complexion, wide mouth, long neck. What she had was presence, intelligence, the ability to command attention. He pulled out a portrait. This is a copy. The original is lost. Everything about Anne is mediated through copies, through second-hand accounts, through the violence of her ending coloring everything about her beginning. He set it down. When she became queen in 1533, the surveillance intensified. Her clothes were noted in diplomatic dispatches, her health monitored for signs of pregnancy, her moods interpreted as evidence of fitness for queenship. Ambrose leaned forward, and when she failed to produce a male heir, when she miscarried, that failure was public, documented, used against her. The same body that had attracted the king became evidence of inadequacy. He pulled out correspondence. By 1536, 3 years after becoming Queen Anne's appearance was being described differently. Same woman, same face. But now the descriptions turned cruel. The wide mouth became evidence of a sharp tongue. The dark complexion suggested moral darkness. The long neck was called serpentine. He set the letters down. They executed her on May 19th, 1536, age 35. Her crime really was that her body failed to produce sons. Everything else was theater. Ambrose looked at the camera. And here's what connects to everything I said in the last lecture. Anne's body was scrutinized, judged, ultimately condemned, not because of what she did, but because of what it failed to do. Produce the right kind of heir. Meet the biological requirements of queenship. He stood. Her daughter Elizabeth learned from this. When Elizabeth became queen, she took control of her image with absolute authority. Commissioned portraits showing her ageless. Wore makeup so thick it was essentially a mask. Refused realistic portraits late in life. Created an icon instead of a woman. He pulled out an Elizabeth portrait. This is from 1588. She was 55. Look at this face. It's not a face. It's a symbol. Carefully constructed image of eternal majesty. By this point, Elizabeth dictated exactly how she could be painted. Only certain artists, only certain poses, only certain representations. He set it down. She turned herself into an image that couldn't age, couldn't fail, couldn't be vulnerable. And it worked. She ruled for 45 years, never married, never gave anyone the power to judge her body's reproductive failure. Ambrose returned to his chair. Two women, two approaches. Anne tried to be human and was destroyed for it. Elizabeth became an icon and survived. He looked at the camera. Margaret and I used to argue about Elizabeth. I admired her political skill. Margaret saw her as trapped, said creating an icon meant killing yourself slowly, becoming a mask instead of a person. He paused. Margaret was right. Elizabeth survived by erasing herself, by letting the image consume the person. That's not triumph. That's tragedy in slow motion. He picked up Margaret's photograph. This is what I'm learning through these lectures, that the invisible history includes the cost of visibility. Anne Boleyn was visible, and it killed her. Elizabeth made herself invisible behind an image and survived but lost herself. He set the photo down. Margaret chose differently. She was visible on her own terms, refused to be an image, refused to meet standards, refused to trade herself for acceptance. His voice steadied. She died at 65. Should have lived longer. Should have had more time. But she lived on her terms, was visible on her terms. And when she died, the person in that hospice bed was the same person I'd known for 43 years. He looked at the camera. That's the lesson Tudor queens can't teach us because they never had the choice. But Margaret can. That visibility on your own terms is worth more than survival on someone else's. He reached for the camera. Even if it's harder, even if it costs you, even if the world would prefer you to be an icon instead of a person. He turned it off. The video went up that night, 150,000 views by morning. But more importantly, the comments showed something shifting. I've been hiding since my husband died, using work as armor. This made me realize I'm doing what Elizabeth did, becoming a mask instead of a person. I'm 70. I've spent my whole life trying to be acceptable. This made me ask, acceptable to whom? For what? Professor Whitmore, you're teaching us about Tudor queens, but really you're teaching us about yourself, about visibility and grief and choosing to be seen. Thank you. Ambrose read every comment. They were right. He was teaching about himself, using history as a mirror to examine the present. And what he saw was this he'd been hiding, using scholarship as armor, becoming invisible in grief. But these lectures were forcing him into visibility, making him confront his own history, his own choices, his own question, what comes next? He recorded the final 2 lectures of part 2 over the next week. Aging was treated as personal failure, he said in lecture 7. Men were allowed to grow into authority. Women were expected to preserve youth long after it naturally faded. He was in his study late afternoon light and slanting through windows. Margaret turned 60 while she was in treatment. I wanted to celebrate. Take her somewhere. She laughed and said, I'm bald from chemo, and you want to celebrate that I'm older. I said I wanted to celebrate that she'd made it to 60. She said, that's not an achievement, that's just not dying yet. He paused. We argued about that. I said making it to 60 is absolutely an achievement. Every year is. She said society doesn't see it that way, especially for women. Every year past 50 is treated as a failure to maintain youth. He pulled out portraits of older Tudor women. These are rare. Tudor art didn't often depict women past their fertile years unless they were queens or unusually powerful. Because once beauty faded, women became invisible. He set them down. Margaret said this was still true, that she'd become invisible in her 50s, that people looked through her instead of at her. That invisibility was its own kind of death. His voice dropped. I told her I still saw her. She said, you don't count. You're biased. I said, being biased doesn't make me wrong. She said, it doesn't make me right either. He looked at the camera. We never resolved that argument. She died still believing that aging made her less visible, less valuable. And I died. He stopped, corrected himself. When she died, I realized she was wrong. She'd never been more visible to me than in those final weeks. Every line on her face told a story. Every gray hair was evidence of time we'd had together. He stood, walked to the window. Tudor women were punished for aging, mocked for trying to maintain beauty, ignored when they failed. The system offered no winning move. Youth was temporary, age was shameful. The transition between was treated as moral failure. He turned back. Margaret lived in 2023, not 1523, but she still felt that pressure, still internalized the message that aging made her less valuable, still couldn't quite believe me when I said she'd never been more beautiful. He returned to his chair. I wish I'd been more persuasive. Wish I'd found words that made her believe. But maybe there are no words for that. Maybe when an entire society tells women their value decreases with age, one man saying the opposite isn't enough. He looked at the camera. But I'll say it anyway, for anyone listening who needs to hear it. Aging is not failure. It's evidence. Evidence that you survived, that you persisted, that you earned every line, every gray hair, every sign of time passing. His voice strengthened. Margaret was more beautiful at 60 than at 25. Not despite the aging. Because of it. Because every year added depth, wisdom, character. Because she became more herself, not less. He reached for the camera. Tudor women didn't get to hear that. The system told them aging was shameful, and they had no choice but to believe it. But you do. We do. We can choose to see aging as evidence instead of failure. He paused. Margaret couldn't, but maybe you can. He turned it off. The final lecture of part 2 was recorded 3 days later. Beauty standards were designed by men, Ambrose said, and there was steel in his voice now. Enforced by men, profited men, women paid the price. He'd decided to end part 2 with anger. Controlled anger, but anger nonetheless. Sumptuary laws controlled what women could wear based on class, fabric restrictions, jewelry limits, sleeve widths, all regulated, all enforced, all designed to make sure women's appearance always indicated the status of the men associated with them. He pulled out legal documents. A well-dressed woman suggested a successful husband. A poorly dressed woman suggested male failure. Women's bodies were billboards for masculine achievement. He set them down. And when women violated these laws, they were punished. Not the men who supposedly controlled them. The women. His voice hardened. Perfect system. Women responsible for displaying male status, but also punished when they got it wrong. He stood. I taught this material for 40 years. Explained the historical context, the legal frameworks, the social pressures, all very academic, very distant. He walked partially out of frame. But Margaret lived it. Not Tudor sumptuary laws, obviously, but the modern version, the constant pressure to look acceptable, to dress appropriately, to signal status through appearance. He returned. She hated it, hated that her appearance was judged, hated that looking professional meant specific clothes, specific grooming, hated that refusing to participate marked her as difficult, unfeminine, not a team player. He sat. She became a professor partly to escape that. Academic dress codes were looser. You could wear jeans and no one cared as long as you published. But even there she felt it. The judgment. The subtle messages that her refusal to perform femininity meant something about her competence. Ambrose looked at the camera. So when I teach about Tudor sumptuary laws about men controlling women's appearance, I'm not just teaching history. I'm teaching about Margaret, about the system that judged her, about the exhausting work of refusing to participate. He picked up her photograph. She was tired. That's what I remember most. Not angry, though she had right to be. Just tired. Tired of being judged. Tired of performing. Tired of the constant work of existing in a world that turned her body into commentary on her value. He set it down. Tudor women were tired too. Tired of cosmetics that poisoned them. Tired of clothes that restricted them. Tired of standards that judged them. Some, like Anne Clifford, opted out. Most couldn't. Kept participating because the alternative was worse. He looked at the camera directly. Margaret opted out. Stopped wearing makeup at 20. Stopped caring about fashion at 30. Stopped trying to meet any standard except her own by 40. And you know what happened? A pause. Nothing. The world kept turning. Her career flourished. Her students loved her. Her colleagues respected her. All the dire warnings about what happens when women refuse to perform femininity turned out to be empty. He leaned forward. That's what I'm learning from all this. From Tudor history. From Margaret's life. From these lectures. That the systems that control women through appearance standards, those systems only work if women participate. They fall apart when women refuse. He stood. Anne Clifford refused Cyrus and lived to 76. Elizabeth I refused marriage and ruled 45 years. Margaret refused beauty standards and built a career, a life, a legacy on her own terms. He walked to the window one final time. The system tells women that refusal means failure. Tells them they'll be punished, excluded, diminished. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes refusal costs you. He turned back. But participation costs you too. In Tudor England, it cost you your health, your years, sometimes your life. In Margaret's world, it cost you time, energy, the exhausting work of constant performance. He returned to his chair. So choose your cost, because there's always a cost, but at least make it a choice. He looked at the camera. That's what Margaret taught me. That's what Tudor history confirms. That's what I'm trying to share with whoever's listening. He reached for the camera. Systems fall apart when we stop participating. Standards lose power when we refuse to meet them. And beauty, real beauty, the kind that matters, exists entirely outside of judgment. He paused. Margaret was beautiful because she chose herself. That's the only beauty standard worth meeting. He turned off the camera. Part 2 was complete. 8 lectures, from medieval faces to Tudor beauty to the systems that controlled both. But more than that, 8 steps toward visibility, toward confronting his own grief. Toward answering the question, what comes next, he uploaded the final lecture. Within hours, it had 200,000 views. The comments poured in. This whole series has been about your wife. I just realized that. You're teaching us history, but really you're teaching us about love and loss. I'm a woman in my 70s. I wish Margaret had lived to see these lectures. She would have been proud. Professor, when does part 3 come out? Because I need to know how this ends. How you're going to choose to live after everything you've taught us. Ambrose read that last comment multiple times. How you're going to choose to live. That was the question, wasn't it? The one he'd been avoiding, the one Sarah's letter had asked, the one Margaret had asked before she died. What comes next? He looked at the outline for part 3, ancient competitions, Greek games, Roman wine culture, public spectacle, and private meaning. He'd planned it as a return to pure history, a way to end on something less personal. But that wasn't going to work anymore. Part 3 couldn't be about retreat. It had to be about resolution, about deciding what comes next. He sat at his desk, picked up his pen, started rewriting the outline for part 3, not about ancient games, about what those games meant, about why humans create spectacle, about how excellence achieved and witnessed creates community, about how maybe, just maybe, he wasn't done yet. Outside winter deepened its hold on the world. Inside, Ambrose Whitmore prepared for the final part of his journey, the part where invisible history would teach him how to become visible again. The email from Sarah arrived the morning Ambrose was supposed to record the first lecture of part 3. Dad, I haven't heard from you in 3 weeks. I'm worried. Can you please call me Tom, and I want to come visit. Talk about the future, about what makes sense for you. I know you're busy with your video project. I've been watching them. They're beautiful, Dad, but they also make me sad. You're talking about Mom and everyone. You're grieving in public. Maybe that's healthy. I don't know. But I worry you're using this project the way you used to use work, as a way to avoid dealing with real life. Please call. Love, Sarah. Ambrose read it twice. Set his phone down, looked at his camera already set up on the tripod. The study around him organized for recording, notes spread across his desk. The pottery fragment from Corinth waiting to make its appearance. Using this project as a way to avoid dealing with real life. Sarah wasn't wrong, but she also wasn't entirely right. Yes, he was grieving in public. Yes, he was talking about Margaret constantly. Yes, he was using history as his medium. But he wasn't avoiding, not anymore. He was processing, working through, using what he knew to understand what he felt. The question was, to what end he'd completed part 2 3 days ago. The response had been overwhelming. Over 500,000 total views across all lectures. Thousands of comments, people sharing stories about their own grief, their own struggles with beauty standards, their own attempts to navigate aging in a world that punished visibility. A community had formed. People who'd never met connected through shared knowledge and shared pain. And Ambrose sat at the center of it simultaneously, teaching and learning, giving and receiving, hiding and becoming visible. But Sarah's question remained, what comes next? He picked up his phone, called his daughter. She answered on the second ring. Dad, finally. Hello, Sarah. Are you okay? I've been worried. I'm fine. Working on the lecture series. A pause, then, Dad, we need to talk about your living situation. I know. You can't stay in that house alone. It's too big, too isolated. You need to be around people. Ambrose looked around his study, books climbing toward the ceiling, Margaret's photograph on his desk, his grandfather's shovel in the corner. 43 years of accumulated life. I know, he said again. So you'll consider moving. He was quiet for a long moment. Can I ask you something first? Of course, Imran. Have you watched all the lectures? Sarah hesitated. Most of them, the medieval ones, some of the Tudor ones. They're hard to watch, Dad. You're so sad. I am sad. Your mother died. I'm allowed to be sad. I know, but nothing. Sarah, these lectures, they're not me avoiding life. They're me figuring out how to keep living. Do you understand the difference? Silence on the other end. When your mother died, Ambrose continued, I didn't know how to keep going. Everything we'd built, everything we'd planned, it was all based on us, together, and then suddenly there was just me. And I didn't know what to do with that. He heard Sarah's breath catch. So yes, I hid. In books, in history, in the past, because the present was unbearable. But these lectures, they changed something. They made me realize that history isn't escape. It's connection. It's how we understand that we're not alone in our struggles. Dad, let me finish, please. She went quiet. I have one more part to record. Part 3, about competition, spectacle, community. About why humans gather to witness excellence. And I hope it's going to help me answer the question you're asking. What comes next? He paused. Give me 2 more weeks. Let me finish this. Then we'll talk about living arrangements, about the future, about all of it. But let me finish first. A long silence. Then Sarah's voice thick with emotion. Okay, 2 weeks. But Dad, yes, I love you. And Mom would be proud of what you're doing, even if it makes me sad to watch. I love you too, sweetheart. He hung up, sat in the quiet study. 2 weeks, to record part 3, to find his answer, to decide what comes next. He looked at the camera, pressed record. I visited Corinth once, Ambrose began, and his voice was steadier than it had been in months. 1987, Margaret and I took a trip after I got tenure. Called it a vacation, but really I just wanted to see the isthmus. Wanted to stand where the Isthmian Games happened. He held up the pottery fragment. Margaret found this. We were walking through the ruins, she bent down and picked it up. The guide said we shouldn't take it, but Margaret smiled and said it was just a broken pot. Surely Greece had enough broken pots. He laughed. Let us keep it. Ambrose set the fragment down gently. I've kept it for 37 years. It sat on Margaret's nightstand. Now it sits on my desk. A piece of clay that crossed 2,000 years to connect us to people who'd been dead longer than our country has existed. He pulled out a map, spread it across his desk. The Isthmus of Corinth, 4 miles wide at its narrowest, the only land bridge between mainland Greece and the Peloponnese. Ships, merchants, armies, everyone passed through here. This was the throat of Greece. He traced the narrow strip with his finger. And every 2 years for over 1,000 years, the entire Greek world converged here for games. Athletic competitions, poetic performances, religious festivals, commercial fairs, all happening simultaneously in controlled chaos. He looked at the camera. I want to talk about why that mattered, not just historically but personally, because I think the Isthmian Games have something to teach us about community, about purpose, about what happens when we gather to witness excellence together. He leaned back. But first I need to tell you why this part is different, why part 3 isn't just about ancient history. He paused. My daughter asked me what comes next, whether I'll keep living alone in this big house hiding in history, or whether I'll rejoin the world. Move closer to family, find community, choose life over dormancy. His voice steadied. I didn't have an answer, but I think the Isthmian Games might help me find one, because they were about gathering, about community, about people choosing to come together to witness each other, to create meaning through shared experience. He picked up the pottery fragment again. This belonged to someone who made that choice, who traveled to Corinth, who stood in crowds, who witnessed excellence, and was part of something larger than themselves. And 2,000 years later, Margaret picked it up and brought it home, connected to that long-dead person through this broken piece of clay. He set it down. That's what this final part is about. Connection across time, community across distance, and the choice to be part of something larger than our individual grief. He looked directly at the camera. So let's talk about the Isthmian Games, about why people traveled for weeks to watch other people compete, about what they found there, and about what that might mean for those of us trying to figure out what comes next. He reached for the camera. Let's talk about choosing community over isolation, excellence over dormancy, life over hiding. He didn't turn off the camera. Instead, he stood, walked to his bookshelf, pulled out a volume on ancient athletics. The games began, he said, returning to frame, according to tradition in 1350 BCE. That's probably mythological, but by the 6th century BCE, they were well established. Held every 2 years in honor of Poseidon. He opened the book. Poseidon, god of the sea, earthquakes, horses. For Corinth, that wasn't abstract theology. That was practical religion. Poseidon ruled the waters on both sides of the isthmus. protected their ships, their trade, their entire economy. He set the book down. When Corinth hosted games in his honor, it wasn't just worship, it was insurance, community investment, a way of saying we honor you, you protect us, everyone benefits. Ambrose sat. And the prizes were worthless. Pine wreaths that died within days. No gold, no money, just dead vegetation. And yet men trained for years, risked serious injury, traveled hundreds of miles for those wreaths. He looked at the camera. Why, that's the question that fascinated me for decades. Why would rational people compete so fiercely for worthless prizes? He leaned forward. Because the prize wasn't the wreath. The wreath was just the symbol. The real prize came after. Your city held banquets in your honor, gave you money, land tax exemptions, built statues, wrote your name in stone, composed poetry about your victory that would outlive everyone you knew. He paused. The wreath died. The glory didn't. That's what they were competing for. Not the moment of victory, but the memory of it, the way their name would be spoken after they were gone. His voice dropped. When Margaret was dying, she asked me what I wanted to be remembered for. I said my scholarship, my teaching. She smiled that morphine soft smile and said, that's not what I asked. I asked what you want to be remembered for, not what you've done, what you want to matter. He looked down. I didn't have an answer. Still don't completely, but I think it has something to do with this, with connection, with the way knowledge creates community, with the way teaching, real teaching, is about witnessing each other's humanity. He looked back up. Greek athletes competed to be witnessed, to have their excellence validated by crowds, to become part of a shared story that outlasted their individual lives. He picked up Margaret's photograph. Margaret understood that. She taught because she wanted to witness her students' growth, wanted to be part of their stories, wanted to create connections that would outlast her. He set the photo down, and she did. I got emails after she died from students she'd taught decades ago, people she'd supervised, mentored, challenged, all saying the same thing. She saw me. She witnessed me. She made me better. His voice caught. That's the legacy that matters, not the publications, not the accolades, the witnessing, the connection, the way we make each other better by paying attention. He stood, walked partially out of frame, then back. The Isthmian Games created space for that. Athletes witnessed each other's excellence. Poets witnessed athletes. Audiences witnessed everyone. And in that mutual witnessing, they created community. He sat. I've been hiding since Margaret died, from people, from connection, from the vulnerability of being witnessed. These lectures changed that, forced me into visibility, made me let people witness my grief. He looked at the camera. And you know what happened? Community formed. People shared their stories, their grief, their struggles. We witnessed each other. And in that witnessing, we became less alone. He leaned forward. That's what the Isthmian Games teach us, that excellence matters, yes. But what matters more is the witnessing, the gathering, the choice to be part of something larger than our individual pain. He reached toward the camera. So let's explore that over the next few lectures, how the Greeks created community through competition, and what that might mean for those of us trying to choose life over isolation. He turned off the camera, sat in the quiet study. Something had shifted. He'd said it out loud, admitted he'd been hiding, acknowledged the community forming, committed to finding his answer. 2 weeks, to finish part 3, to decide what comes next. He uploaded the video that night. By morning, 300,000 views. The comments made him cry. We're witnessing you, Professor, and you're making us better. This is what community looks like. People choosing to be present for each other's grief and growth. Please don't stop these lectures. Not because we need the history, because we need the connection. He read every comment, felt the weight of it, the responsibility of being witnessed, the gift of witnessing others. He recorded the next lecture 2 days later. Athletes trained brutally, Ambrose said, spreading ancient training manuals across his desk. Specialized, obsessive. They lived in gymnasia, followed strict diets, worked under coaches who trained under other coaches in unbroken lines going back generations. He picked up one manual. Here's a training regimen for runners. Rise before dawn. Run 10 stages, that's about 1.25 miles. Rest. Massage with oil. Lunch of barley bread, soft cheese, dried figs. Afternoon sprint training. Light run in evening. Meat for dinner. Wine mix 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Sleep. Repeat. He set it down. Every day, for years, or for a competition that lasted minutes. all for a wreath that died within days. He looked at the camera. I used to think that was irrational, disproportionate effort for minimal reward, but I understand it now. He stood, walked to the window. Margaret trained for teaching the way Greek athletes trained for competition. Read constantly, prepared obsessively, thought about pedagogy the way athletes thought about technique. Not because she had to, because she wanted to be excellent. He turned back. I asked her once why she worked so hard, spent so many hours on lectures she'd taught dozens of times. She said, because they deserve my best, every student, every class, every time. He returned to his chair. That's what the Greek athletes understood, that excellence isn't about the reward. It's about the dedication, the discipline, the choice to give your best even when no one would know if you didn't. He picked up another manual. Here's an inscription honoring a wrestler named Sostratus, won the pancration 3 times. The inscription says he broke his leg in his final bout but finished the match. He won. He never walked correctly again. The crown of pine was worth it. Ambrose set it down carefully. He never walked correctly again, but he won. And 2,000 years later, we still know his name. He looked at the camera. Margaret never walked correctly after the cancer surgery, nerve damage in her left leg. She limped for the last 6 months of her life. But she kept teaching, kept mentoring, kept giving her best. His voice roughened. I asked her why she didn't retire. Take it easy, rest. She looked at me like I'd suggested she stop breathing, said, this is what I am, not what I do, what I am. He paused. So Stratus was a wrestler. Margaret was a teacher. Both understood that excellence isn't separate from identity. It's how we choose to show up in the world. He leaned forward. The training manuals don't just describe physical preparation. They describe a way of life, a commitment to being your best self even when it costs you, even when you're tired, even when you're hurt. He picked up Margaret's photograph. She taught me that, through example, through the way she showed up every day, even when she was exhausted from treatment, even when she knew she was dying, even when it would have been easier to quit. He set it down. The Greeks called it arete, excellence, virtue, being your best self, not for reward, not for recognition, but because that's what being fully human means. He looked at the camera. Margaret had arete. She trained for it, practiced it, lived it, and when she died, her students remembered. Not her publications, not her awards, the way she showed up, the excellence she brought to every interaction. He stood. That's what competition at the Isthmian Games was really about. Not defeating others, but demonstrating arete, showing the world your best self, being witnessed in your excellence. He walked to where his grandfather's shovel leaned. This shovel, Samuel, my grandfather trained with this every spring, prepared the garden, turned the soil, not because he had to, because he wanted to do it excellently, wanted the garden to be his best work. He returned to frame. That's training, that's discipline, that's the Greek concept of arete applied to a Pennsylvania garden. Excellence in everything, not for others, for yourself. He sat. I haven't trained for anything in 9 months, haven't pushed myself, haven't tried to be excellent. I've been surviving, going through motions, doing the minimum. He looked at the camera. These lectures changed that, made me train again, prepare, push myself to be clear, honest, vulnerable, to bring my best to this teaching, even if it's just me and a camera in an empty study. He leaned forward. That's what the Greek athletes teach us, that training matters, that discipline matters, that choosing excellence, even when no one would know if you didn't, that's how we stay human in the face of grief. He reached toward the camera. So the question becomes, what are you training for? What excellence are you pursuing? Not for reward, not for recognition, but because being your best self is what makes life meaningful. He paused. I'm training to figure out what comes next, to answer my daughter's question, to honor Margaret's legacy by choosing life over dormancy. He turned off the camera. 2 more lectures to go. The penultimate lecture was about poets and musicians. Alongside athletes, Ambrose began, poets and musicians arrived at the Isthmian Games. They competed too. Lyre players, flute performers, singers who performed hymns or epic narratives. These competitions were judged publicly. Winning carried just as much prestige as athletic victory. He held up ancient musical notation. This is a fragment of a victory ode, the melody. The words praising Poseidon and the victor, designed to be memorable, to travel. Music was how victory became permanent. He set it down. A race lasts minutes. The athlete crosses the finish line, receives his crown, and then what? The moment is over. But a victory ode that lives, gets performed at banquets, festivals, gatherings, spreads the victor's name across Greece, carried by voices embedded in memory. He picked up a book of Pindar's odes. Pindar made a career writing these. Here's part of one for an Isthmian victor. He whom the god loves wins glory that endures. Brief is the strength of men's hands, but the song outlasts the stadium. Your name, Melissus, will echo when your bones are dust. Ambrose closed the book. Your bones are dust, but poetry preserves. That's the transaction. You, when I write, you're remembered. The athlete provided the moment. The poet provided immortality. He looked at the camera. Margaret loved Pindar. Used to read him to me in Greek. I didn't understand most of it, but I could hear the rhythm, feel the power of the language. He picked up a notebook from his desk. Margaret's. After she died, I found this. Notebook full of poems she'd copied. Greek, Latin, medieval verses. On the last page, she'd written a line from Pindar. He opened to the page, read, "Brief is the span of our light, but excellence achieved and witnessed endures." His voice broke. That's what she believed. That our lives are brief, but what we do with them, the excellence we achieve, the way we let ourselves be witnessed, that endures. He set the notebook down. She was a poet in her way, not in verse, but in the way she shaped lives, her students, her colleagues, me. She composed us through her teaching, her example, her witnessing. He looked at the camera. And now, 9 months after her death, I'm still being shaped by her, still hearing her voice, still trying to live up to the excellence she modeled. He stood, walked to the bookshelf, pulled out her published works. These are Margaret's books. Scholarship on Material, Culture, Domestic Life, The Invisible History of Ordinary People. Published by university presses. Cited by other scholars. This is her victory ode. Her way of making her brief span endure. He set them on his desk. But these aren't what I remember. What endures for me isn't the scholarship. It's the way she laughed. The way she read poetry. The way she believed that teaching was about witnessing people into their best selves. He sat. That's what poets at the Isthmian Games understood. That memory is active. It requires performance, repetition, community. Songs had to be sung to endure. Stories had to be told. He looked at the camera. These lectures are my way of singing Margaret's song, of telling her story, of making sure her brief span endures beyond my individual memory. He leaned forward. But they're also my way of figuring out my own song. What I want to endure. What excellence I want to be witnessed achieving. He picked up the pottery fragment. This person, whoever they were, they're dust. Their bones are gone, their name is lost. But this fragment endures. Evidence that they existed, that they were part of the Isthmian Games, part of community. He set it down. I want to be part of community again. Want to choose witnessing over hiding. Want to compose something that endures beyond my individual grief. He looked at the camera. Pindar was right. Our span is brief. But excellence achieved and witnessed endures. The question is, what excellence are we achieving? Who's witnessing? What are we composing? He reached toward the camera. One more lecture, then I'll have my answer. He turned it off, sat in the quiet study. One more lecture, then decision time. He uploaded the video that night. 400,000 views by morning. And in the comments, people sharing what they wanted to endure, what excellence they were pursuing, what communities they were choosing. A poet had started a conversation. Margaret would have loved it. The final lecture was recorded on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks to the day since Sarah's email. Ambrose sat at his desk, the camera ready. But before pressing record, he did something different. He called Sarah. Hi, Dad. Hi, sweetheart. I'm recording the last lecture today. Okay. And I wanted to tell you first, before I say it to the camera, I have my answer about what comes next. He heard her breath catch. I'm not moving into a retirement community. Not yet. But I'm not staying isolated either. What does that mean? It means I'm going to teach again. Not at Columbia, but somewhere. A community college, maybe. A continuing education program. Somewhere people want to learn about the invisible history. Silence. And I'm going to volunteer at the library. Maybe a hospice, somewhere I can use what I know to help people. Dad, let me finish. I'm also going to visit you more. Come to San Francisco. Spend time with the grandkids. Be present instead of hiding. He paused. But I'm keeping the house and the study and the work. Because this is what I am, not what I do, what I am. And Margaret taught me that running from that doesn't honor her memory. Living it does. Sarah was crying. He could hear it. She'd be proud of you. I hope so. I am too. They talked for another 20 minutes, made plans, set dates, chose connection over distance. Then Ambrose hung up, pressed record. This is the final lecture, he began, and I need to start with a confession. These 12 lectures haven't been about history. Not really. They've been about grief, about loss, about trying to figure out how to keep living when the person who made life meaningful is gone. He looked directly at the camera. I've been hiding for 9 months, using scholarship as armor against the present, and these lectures were supposed to be my final project before giving up, before retreating into dormancy. He paused. But something happened. You happened. This community. The comments, the stories, the way we've witnessed each other's grief and growth. That changed everything. He stood, walked to the corner, picked up his grandfather's shovel. This is Samuel. I've mentioned him before. My grandfather's shovel. Named, maintained, kept for 35 years because I made a promise. He carried it to his desk. But it's more than a promise now. It's a connection to my grandfather, to continuity, to the idea that objects can carry relationships across time. He set it down. The Isthmian Games were about that, about creating connections across time through shared spectacle. Athletes competed, poets sang, audiences witnessed. And in that witnessing, they created community that outlasted any individual life. He picked up the pottery fragment. Margaret found this at Corinth, connected across 2,000 years to someone who'd been part of those games, part of that community. He set it down gently. And now I'm doing the same thing, connecting across 9 months to Margaret, across weeks to you, across centuries to medieval people, Tudor women, Greek athletes, all through the act of witnessing, of being present to each other's humanity. He sat. So here's what I learned from the Isthmian Games, from Greek athletes who trained for worthless prizes, from poets who composed songs that outlasted bones, from audiences who traveled weeks just to witness excellence. He leaned forward. I learned that community is a choice, that we create it through gathering, through witnessing, through choosing to be present to each other. That excellence matters not for reward, but because it's how we honor our brief span. That memory endures through active participation, not passive consumption. He picked up Margaret's photograph. And I learned that grief doesn't mean dormancy, that choosing life after loss isn't betrayal, that the best way to honor the dead is to keep living excellently, keep teaching, keep connecting, keep being witnessed. He set the photo down. Margaret asked me what all this knowledge was for. I didn't have an answer then, but I do now. He looked at the camera. It's for connection, for creating community across time and space, for witnessing each other into our best selves, for making sure that our brief span and the brief spans of those we love endure through memory, through teaching, through the stories we tell. He stood. So here's my answer to the question everyone's been asking. What comes next? He walked to the window, looked out. I'm going to keep teaching, not hide in it, but actually do it, at community colleges, libraries, anywhere people want to learn, because knowledge dies when it's not shared. And I'm not ready for that death yet. He turned back. I'm going to volunteer, find ways to use what I know to help people, because witnessing others is how we stay human. He returned to his chair. I'm going to visit my daughter more, spend time with my grandchildren, choose family over isolation. Because Margaret taught me that relationships matter more than scholarship. He picked up the pottery fragment one final time. But I'm also keeping this study, these books, this work, because this is what I am. A teacher, a witness, someone who believes the invisible history matters because it reminds us we're all human, all struggling, all trying to make our brief span mean something. He looked directly at the camera. The Isthmian Games ended in 393 CE, one decree. 1,000 years of tradition finished. The sanctuary at Corinth fell into ruins. The athletes stopped coming. The poets stopped singing. The community dispersed. He set the fragment down. But the idea survived, that humans need spectacle, need to gather, need to witness excellence together, need to create meaning through shared experience. He leaned forward. This lecture series is my Isthmian Games, my way of gathering people, of creating community, of witnessing and being witnessed. And it doesn't end here. He smiled slightly. I'm going to keep recording, keep teaching, keep connecting, because that's what Margaret would want. Not for me to hide in her memory, but to honor it by living excellently. He stood one final time. So thank you for watching, for commenting, for sharing your stories, for witnessing my grief and letting me witness yours. You've taught me that community isn't about proximity, it's about presence, about choosing to show up for each other. He walked to where Samuel leaned. My grandfather died never knowing his shovel would teach his grandson how to keep living after loss. Margaret died never knowing her question would lead to this. The Isthmian Games ended never knowing they'd teach a grieving widower how to choose life. He returned to frame one last time. Brief is the span of our light, but excellence achieved and witnessed endures. He looked at the camera. I choose to endure, to keep teaching, to keep connecting, to keep being present. He picked up Margaret's photograph. This is for you, Margaret. All of it, the lectures, the community, the choice to keep going, because you taught me that knowledge is meant to be shared, that excellence is worth pursuing, that being witnessed is how we become our best selves. He set it down. And this is for everyone watching. You've witnessed me. You've made me better. You've reminded me that I'm not alone in my grief. He reached toward the camera. So here's to the invisible history, to the people who lived without mirrors, who dictated love to strangers, who were cursed for being left-handed, who named their tools, who died for beauty, who competed for worthless prizes, who sang songs that outlasted bones. He paused. Here's to all of us, trying to make our brief span matter, trying to be witnessed, trying to endure. He smiled. See you in the next series, because this isn't ending. It's just beginning. He turned off the camera, sat in the quiet study. It was done. 12 lectures, 20,000 words spoken across weeks. A community built, a decision made. He uploaded the final video. Within an hour, 500,000 views. The comments poured in. Thank you for letting us witness you. You've changed my life. This isn't goodbye. This is hello to whatever comes next. Professor Whitmore, you asked what all your knowledge was for. It was for this, for reminding us we're human, we're connected, we're not alone. And one buried deep in the comments that made him stop. I'm Dr. Elena Morrison. I sent you an email at the start of part 2. Margaret was my mentor. And I just wanted to say she'd be so proud. You finally let yourself be visible. That's harder than any scholarship. Welcome back to the world, Professor. Ambrose read it 3 times. Welcome back to the world. He looked around his study, at the books, at Margaret's photograph, at his grandfather's shovel, at the pottery fragment from Corinth. All of it still here, all of it still part of his life. But he wasn't hiding in it anymore. He was using it to connect, to teach, to witness and be witnessed. He picked up his phone, texted Sarah, "The last lecture is up. I'm ready to visit. When works for you?" Her response came immediately. "Anytime, Dad. Anytime. We love you." He set the phone down, stood, walked to the window. Outside, winter was releasing its grip. Early signs of spring, buds on trees, light lasting longer, the world preparing to bloom again. Inside, Ambrose Whitmore felt something similar. Not happiness, not yet, but possibility. The sense that life wasn't over, that there was still work to do, still connections to make, still excellence to pursue. He turned from the window, looked at his study one more time. "Thank you," he said, to Margaret's memory, to his grandfather's shovel, to the pottery fragment, "for holding me while I figured it out." He walked to his desk, opened his calendar, started making plans. Community college teaching opportunities to research, hospice volunteer programs to investigate, flights to San Francisco to book, a new series to outline, maybe something on Roman daily life, or medieval commerce, or the invisible history of grief across cultures. There was work to do. There was always work to do, but now, for the first time in 9 months, he wanted to do it. Not to hide, but to connect. Not to avoid the present, but to use the past to illuminate it. Not to be alone, but to create community. Brief is the span of our light, but excellence achieved and witnessed endures. Ambrose Whitmore closed his notebook, turned off his desk lamp, left the study. Tomorrow he'd start planning the next series. Tonight he'd call his daughter back, talk to his grandchildren, be present, because that's what Margaret would want. Not for him to stop grieving, but to keep living while he grieved. Not for him to forget her, but to honor her by being his best self. Not for him to hide in history, but to use history to rejoin the world. He walked through his house, too big for one person. Sarah was right about that, but not too big for a person who was choosing to fill it with connection. With students, with colleagues, with family, with the community that forms when we choose to witness each other. He looked at Margaret's photograph one more time, the one in the living room. I'm choosing life, he told her, like you taught me, like the Greeks taught me, well, like everyone in the invisible history taught me. The photograph didn't respond, but somewhere he hoped she was proud. He turned off the lights, went to bed. Tomorrow would come, and he would meet it. Not with perfect answers, not with complete healing, but with the choice to keep going, to keep teaching, to keep being witnessed, to keep honoring his brief span by living it excellently. The invisible history had taught him well. Now it was time to write his own. 6 months later, Ambrose Whitmore stood in a community college classroom in San Francisco, 15 students scattered across the seats, ranging in age from 19 to 73. My name is Professor Whitmore, he began, and I want to tell you about the parts of history that nobody talks about. The students looked up, some with notebooks ready, others with skepticism, all with that hunger he recognized, the hunger for connection, for knowledge that mattered, for being witnessed. Medieval people, he continued, died without knowing what they looked like. Not approximately, not sort of, at all. A student raised her hand. How did they deal with that? Ambrose smiled. That's exactly the right question. And over the next 12 weeks, we're going to explore it together. Not just the history, but what it teaches us about being human, about connection, about how we create meaning. The students settled in, and Ambrose Whitmore began teaching again, not hiding in scholarship, but using it to create community. Brief is the span of our light, but excellence achieved and witnessed endures. And somewhere in the invisible history, Margaret smiled.